One organization that I have a lot of trouble figuring out is the Kansas City Chiefs. And what I mean is, are they a team that is just content with being kind of middle of the pack? Are they just a team that's content with being a thought, not being an afterthought, but not being front and center in everybody's mind as a real legit contender? It's hard for me to figure out what the Kansas City Chiefs, frankly, are really trying to accomplish as an organization. The simple fact of the matter is that on defense, they can really get after the passer, primarily just in Houston, but they're very soft on the back end, in particular their secondary. And then on offense, you're not winning a championship with Alex Smith, period. And the people that continue to insist that this is going to happen need to get over themselves and need to stop the madness. And as much as everybody focuses on the lack of touchdowns from their wide receivers in 2014, a grand total of 0, it's not just because of the wide receivers. And if you think it is just because of the wide receivers, then you are sadly mistaken. However, this is a team that has been lacking at that wide receiver position for quite a period of time. And when you look at it, yeah, you had some emergence from Travis Kelce, the second-year tight end out of Cincinnati, and you have Jamal Charles and Niall Davis, a nice 1-2 combination in the backfield. You really don't fret or worry about that Kansas City Chiefs offense all that much. It's that type of team that if they can keep it close and keep it tight, they have a chance to win because they hope their quarterback doesn't screw it up and they can control the ball, control the clock. But they're a team that if you could jump on them early, get them down by 10 points or more, it's a wrap because the defense will start to cave a little bit. And then offensively, they just don't have the ability, the skill, the firepower to be able to catch up. And when you're playing in a division with quarterbacks like Phillip Rivers and in particular Peyton Manning and those offenses, you have to be able to do more on the offensive side of the ball than the Kansas City Chiefs have been able to do in recent years. So it stands to reason, understandably, that a lot of people were expecting the Kansas City Chiefs to look at the offensive side of the ball early and often in the 2015 NFL Draft. Many mock drafts for a long period of time, foolishly, again, I mind you, had the Chiefs taking a wide receiver in round 1. Why would you do that? It's only by far their biggest team need, even with the signing of Jeremy Maclin in free agency. Why would you think the Kansas City Chiefs would be addressing wide receiver in round number 1? This is not Andy Reid's deal. This is not Andy Reid's history. And the best that I can recall, the last wide receiver that a team of Andy Reid's took in the first round was Jeremy Maclin, coming out of Missouri several years back by the Eagles. That was several years back, and you have to go way, way back before you can find a wide receiver taken in the first round by the Philadelphia Eagles. Just think about that. This is not a guy in Andy Reid that believes in investing high picks on that position, on the skill players, for whatever reason. If it's the arrogance of the system, if it's the arrogance of believing in himself as a coach, if it's the arrogance of just flat-out stupidity, I don't really know, and I don't get it. Now, I will say this. Based off of where the Chiefs were drafting at number 18, it was going to be maybe a little difficult for them to justify taking a wide receiver there based off of the way the board had broken down. You already had Cooper, White, and Devontae Parker off the board. It might have been a bit rich for their blood for a guy like Dorial Green-Beckham, for a guy like a Devin Smith, for a guy like a Breshad Perryman, for a guy like a Nelson Aguilar, perhaps. So I could understand in some ways maybe why the Chiefs didn't spend a first-round pick on a wide receiver. I'm still surprised, though, that they invested multiple picks on the first 2 days to their secondary. Look, I understand you are playing in a division where you have to face Peyton Manning twice a year, and to face Phillip Rivers twice a year, and in the future perhaps Derek Carr twice a year, and your secondary was vulnerable, was weak in 2014. I could understand maybe the temptation of taking a guy like a Marcus Peters because you feel that he was a guy without some of the locker room problems, was potentially a top 10 pick in this year's draft. So I could understand falling in love with a prospect like that, and you do your research, you feel confident and comfortable taking him with the 18th overall pick. But again, this is not the type of pick that I think turns things around. This is not the type of pick that takes you to that next level. And maybe it would have been wiser for the Chiefs to perhaps gamble on a wide receiver or on an offensive lineman, especially when you consider in round 2 that they reached by at least a round, in my opinion, by getting Mitch Morse out of Missouri, who does remind me somewhat actually of his teammate from last year, or 2 years ago, excuse me, Justin Britt, a guy that was viewed by many to be a big reach coming out of Missouri, who the Seahawks took at the end of round number 2. They finally did address wide receiver in round number 3 by getting a height, weight, speed type of guy in Chris Conley out of Georgia. This was a guy that lit the combine on fire with his vertical and with his 40 time, with his size and his measurables. But a guy that in many ways was more athlete than football player and wide receiver at Georgia. Maybe in part he was a little underutilized and improperly utilized at Georgia, I'll grant you, but still a guy that's more athletic prospect than wide receiver prospect at this point in time. And I was kind of surprised based off of the system that Andy Reid runs when you have guys like Justin Hardy, let's say, on the board, why you would gamble on somebody like a Chris Conley. I just look at this Chiefs draft and again, last year they took Dee Ford in the first round for whatever reason. Perhaps to provide themselves with some long-term flexibility and insurance against Tamba Hali and or Justin Houston's contract situations. But, what did Dee Ford do as a rookie? And then now you've got this year. I understand you have Eric Berry as a safety coming back from his cancer treatments, and hopefully everything goes well there. And you had some weaknesses at corner last year, even with the third-round pick you spent on a Phillip Gaines. I understand wanting to address it, but at the end of the day, the Chiefs just can't score enough points in an explosive enough manner on a consistent enough basis. And when you're spending your first 2 picks on a corner and an offensive lineman who may be a long-term starter for you on the interior, but could have perhaps been there another round or 2 later, and then when you do draft a wide receiver, you're a guy that maybe has a Martavis Bryant type of impact, but might always just be more of an athletic tease than a football player. It's kind of hard to really sit there and keep a lot of praise on this Chiefs organization. I mean, it really, really is. You had some clear-cut needs, and while I'm not always a fan of just drafting for need, I'm not. I do think that based off of the first 3 rounds, their picks could have been a whole lot better based off of the board combined with the needs that the team had. Now, in terms of their best pick, I do think it was still Marcus Peters. I think he'll be the number 1 corner that they frankly needed. A guy that could surprise, I think, is Ramik Wilson, their 4th-round pick, the inside linebacker from Georgia. Here's a guy that can provide you some insurance in case Derek Johnson doesn't come fully recovered from his torn Achilles. But here's a guy that can maybe play alongside Derek Johnson, or he spends a year learning behind a guy like a Derek Johnson. Ramik Wilson's a guy I like quite a bit coming out of Georgia. I thought this was a good pick for the Chiefs and a good value spot here on day number 3. Some of the picks I second guess. I look at Mitch Morse, and I say, I thought he could have been there another round later. I understand it, though, because here's a guy that could perhaps be your center or maybe your right guard for the next 8 to 10 years. Chris Conley, similar thing. I personally thought there were better wide receivers still on the board at this point in time, but the Chiefs gambled on athleticism and speed and explosiveness and size, and I understand that, too. I'm just not sure I fully agree with it, especially with the type of system that the Chiefs run. Yes, Conley brings a type of explosive element along with the Jeremy Maclin that their offense so sorely lacked in 2014. But Conley is going to have to be able to do enough other things to be able to actually get on the football field to be able to unleash that athleticism and explosiveness. And I'm not sure he's going to be able to do that or not as a rookie. Just in general, I have some concerns about the Chiefs' philosophy in this draft. At least this time, they were done with the price that they had to pay to get Alex Smith. They had their full complement of picks. It's one of these drafts that will probably look better in 2 or 3 years than it does now. Right now, I would give them a grade of a C-, but Peters is probably going to be a long-term starter. Mitch Morse is probably going to be a long-term starter. Chris Conley perhaps can become a long-term starter. Steven Nelson could be a very nice nickel-dime slot corner for them for several years. Ramik Wilson could be a long-term starter inside for them. So there are picks here that I think after a couple of years, as things play out, their draft will look better than it does right now. Because right now, it's hard to sit here and really look at this draft and really praise the Kansas City Chiefs. They still have big needs on the offensive side of the ball, and they failed to address them. I do think they ultimately probably got some good players, but not the type of players that are going to make any real difference when it comes to the AFC West in 2015.